Alright, we are recording for, yes, okay. Want to make sure my notes are situated right. For what is the penultimate chapter of iRobot. It's titled Evidence. And it is, of the different chapters, it is one of the few, and I've mentioned this before, that definitely stand out in my mind, despite it originally being like 15 years ago that I read it. So what is the premise to it? I don't feel like going through too carefully in this. Like I do in something else. It's just weird the going back and forth between. Anyhow, so what is the premise? The underlying premise is this. The fundamental premise is this. What if you had a humanoid robot? As in a robot that completely appears human. What would this entail? Now, on its own, that's kind of an interesting idea. But to make it more interesting, Asimov has framed this question in a very specific way, which is a political election. Where one guy, Quinn, I believe is his name, he's not as interesting as Byerly, who is the one that, in theory, could be the robot. And he has come to US Robotics, more specifically to Lanning, who is Director Emeritus, something like that. Basically, he is retired, but he still has strong connections to the company, such that he is somebody who is sufficiently external to the company that you can go to and talk to without it provoking issues. But he also has enough connections that he can do various research, various investigations that can come to an answer one way or another. Also, Susan Calvin is there, which in theory could just be that Lanning has invited her because she would be the expert here. But Quinn has observed that his opponent, Byerly, who is a local prosecutor, that he has never been seen eating or drinking or sleeping in public. Which would kind of suggest, oh, well, maybe he doesn't eat, maybe he doesn't drink, maybe he doesn't sleep, which would make him a robot. And he is very much a politician. I'm not sure if I would necessarily say Byerly is as well with some of what he does. Byerly definitely is very intelligent. He is politically aware, even if he is not a politician. So anyway, Quinn is essentially blackmailing US Robotics. He is. Because he makes the point that even if it's false, if I just make this claim, everyone's going to come and hate on you. You're going to be the target because US Robotics is the only place that could produce the components involved. Technically, that's not entirely true. How it's described, the bodies could potentially be made by somebody else, but the positronic brain, those things are too complex, those things are too sensitive to be made by anyone but US Robotics. But it's like no, they're all accounted for. When a robot fails, it's going to be decommissioned. The brain is either destroyed or recycled. So basically, there wouldn't be any floating around. Which is something never fully explored in this, like how one could get the holds on a brain, but you're just basically acknowledging maybe that's possible. It allows that to be the case. But it is still, Quinn is blackmailing them. That's straight up, well, it maybe not blackmail, but it's definitely extortion. Because it's, well, if you don't do this, and if you don't do what I want you to do, which is investigate, then I can just say this stuff, and everyone will attack you. And everyone will attack Byerly. So, yeah, and I just want to check, what is... Also, the way they describe it, this is Quinn talking. Byerly's past is unremarkable. A quiet life in a small town, a college education, a wife who died young, an auto accident with a slow recovery, law school, coming to the metropolis, an attorney. Yeah, but his present life, that is remarkable. Our district attorney never eats. And this is what he's telling them. Oh yeah, there's also an interesting point a little later. Okay, this is still with their discussion with Quinn. It's weird where the breaks are, because like there's one at the I don't know if you can really like that. There's one at the top, but it's kind of like the same conversation. Anyhow, But a point is also made that all positronic robots are leased, not sold. The corporation remains the owner and manager of each robot and is therefore responsible for the actions of all. Which that actually makes the likelihood of a brain being mistakenly lost very difficult, because it's their property. It's not. It's like you have to account for these things. There's also never been anything suggesting a way to reprogram a positronic brain. There are certain issues with the story, but as was the previous one or one before, I made a point in one of the previous videos that this is a collection of short stories. Potentially, these were not written in a coherent or consistent manner, in that, yes, this does seem to be an inconsistency. What happens to positronic brains and can they be reprogrammed, things like that. We seem to be saying that now that is possible, whereas before it was never mentioned, and even kind of seemed like you couldn't. Because, take Liar. No. Little Lost Robot. Sorry, Little Lost Robot. If you consider that, that's the one where no, not Cutie. Dave. Was it Dave? No. Nestor. That was it. It was Nestor. Sorry. Had gotten a modified version of the first law of robotics and all that. It's like, well, if they could just reprogram the positronic brains, then it's well, it doesn't matter. We take these 63, wipe their brains, and just send 62 on their way, and the one we reprogram that. And it's like, it's not going to cost as much as the robots themselves to do that, you would think. So it is one of those things. It's likely just an inconsistency because they were completely separate when the stories were written. Yeah, this quote I have here is basically where the extortion is. Yeah, I just want to make sure. Oh, no. Okay. This is now they're talking with Byerly. Lanning, Calvin, and Byerly. And this is Lanning speaking. The mere fact that such a contention could be advanced and publicized by the means at this man's, Quinn's, disposal would be a bad blow to the company I represent, even if the charge were never proven. You understand me? Oh yes, this is now Byerly talking. Oh yes, your position is clear to me. The charge itself is ridiculous. The spot you find yourself in is not. I beg your pardon if my laughter offended you. It was the first I laughed at, not the second. How can I help you? So it is this further acknowledgement that, yes, they are being extorted. Yeah, just want to check on what this next thing was. So, and it's very much politics. But Quinn is too much the politician. Byerly is politically aware, politically savvy, but in some ways he's not a politician. I mean, he makes very good political plays here, which I will get to. But first, I want to cover this, because now Calvin is talking in this conversation between the three of them. Oh, are robots so different from men mentally? Byerly asks. World's different. She allowed herself a frosty smile. Robots are essentially decent. It's not been so clearly stated, I would say, previously, that she is kind of a misanthrope. Which, for those that aren't familiar, that does mean just not liking people at all. But in any case, shortly after this, since you're a robopsychologist, there's the term she prefers, and a woman, I'll bet that you've done something that Dr. Lanning hasn't thought of. And what is that? You've got something to eat in your purse. Because Lanning and Calvin have gone to him, because of Quinn, to try to get proof that he is or is not a robot, and just him eating would be sufficient. And Lanning wants it to be done publicly, and Byerly is like, no, I'm not going to do that. Why? And Calvin she brought an apple and is going to hand it to him, and he does take a bite and eat it in front of them. Which is, then point out, doesn't necessarily mean much, but I dislike this. As a robot psychologist and a woman, it's like, that. No, this doesn't have to be for just a woman. It's more, I think, what the goal is. She doesn't give a shit if he's a robot or not. She really doesn't care. So to her, it's more like just a curiosity. That's all she's looking to satisfy. Lanning, however, wants to satisfy public opinion. So does Quinn. Well, Quinn wants to manipulate public opinion. But Lanning just wants to satisfy that, which means he needs something public. I mean, if all he needed was to satisfy himself, yeah, bring food. Completely natural. Any man would think of that. Any woman would as well. But the goals are different. Lanning's goal is not to satisfy himself. It is to have proof one way or another. And so in that regard, yeah, this is actually a stupid... I don't like that writing. There's oh yes, a woman would think this and a man wouldn't. It's like, no, both would. It's just, that doesn't satisfy Lanning's goals. So he doesn't consider it. Okay. But it is also pointed out that, well, if anyone's going to go through the trouble, and this is Calvin pointing it out, if anyone is going to go through the trouble of making a robot to impersonate a human, they're going to have systems in there to handle eating, because there might be times you need to. Which part of the setup is basically, it is an unprovable question short of actually exploratory surgery, more or less. Somehow invading the Biolee's body would require something of that order to prove it one way or another, which he can just refuse that. That can't be compelled on him. But now this next highlight is what Biolee's response to all this is. And actually, hang on, let me first check this. Okay. I don't think I've missed anything here. Oh, wait, no, I do want to... Okay, yes. There was two other points that I had at the start. One I will mention, the other let me mark it. So I will try to come back to that later. It's actually more relevant for the next chapter anyway. Yeah, just that... So at this point, it is mentioned about... because of the ship in the... Was that the previous chapter? Yes, in Escape. Where now they have the ability to... They are capable of interstellar travel. And it mentions that, oh yes, now there are colonies on some of the planets closest to Earth. The only problem is that in Escape, it's established that the ship could take them to other galaxies. Why would you be limited to... And that's the first effort, and they've perfected it since then. Why would you limit yourself to just the nearest planets? I mean, if anything... Sorry, but it would kind of be what I set up in the Catherineverse, where you would have people that would scan around looking for viable planets, but if a viable planet is 1,000 light years away, you go to that one. You don't worry about the ones that are 100 light years away, if they're not viable. So, yeah, it's... Anyway, yeah, so now we get to Biolee's plan for this. I mean that I'm going to let him go ahead, concerning Quinn, choose his rope, test its strength, cut off the right length, tie the noose, insert his head, and grin. I can do what little else is required. You are mighty confident. Susan Calvin rose to her feet. Come, Alfred, we won't change his mind for him. You see, Biolee smiled gently, you're a human psychologist too. So I like this. This does show a level of political savviness that not all politicians necessarily have. Quinn certainly doesn't. Because all Biolee has to do is nothing. His best move is to not move at all, which will force Quinn to either drop the matter, which is to Biolee's advantage, or to push on it. He has to make the moves, which is still to Biolee's advantage if he is human. And if he's not human, then it's still he may be able to make certain... Because technically the whole chapter is meant to leave it somewhat ambiguous. Enough things are possible to suggest that he is human, but there's also some stuff where it's like, well, this isn't explained, so how do we account for, is he in fact a robot? Has a theory, is there still a possible theory there? But anyway. Come on. Yeah, here's a paragraph here that, I don't need to read it out entirely, but it's essentially Calvin going through the 3 laws of robotics and explaining that these three laws are essentially just basic laws of ethics as well in humans. So you can't psychologically prove he is a robot or a human, because a robot and a very good human would have the same responses. Okay, and then there is also this example that is not so good, because there's a question of, okay, well, he's a prosecutor. Hasn't he ever prosecuted somebody leading to their execution, which would violate the first law, a person being sentenced to death? And there are some things that he has wrong that Asimov describes in here incorrectly, which maybe it's just things have changed legally since he's written this, or actually some of it does vary from state to state as well. But Lanning makes the point that, well, that alone proves that he can't be a robot, because technically any punishment could be construed as harm, which first law forbids. And also, if he were to have somebody convicted and then sentenced to the death penalty, then again, he would be violating the first law. But Calvin counters this. Alfred, she said, don't talk foolishly. What if a robot came upon a madman about to set fire to a house with people in it? He would stop the madman, wouldn't he? Of course. And if the only way he could stop him was to kill him. This is a problem. The trolley dilemma is a better one. This is poor because, in theory, a robot could just grapple with and restrain the madman. And so that would stop it. There's also the matter that most people aren't mad when they're in court. As in mad crazy, not mad angry. But yeah, so it's not as though it would clearly indicate that this person is in fact deserving of it or is a threat to others. You may have rational evidence, but in some cases, some of that may still be circumstantial or just open to debate. So you would still run into the issue of rationalizing somebody who seems to be rational themselves being a threat just because evidence that potentially is only telling half the story anyway. It still is the question of, is it enough? Is it enough evidence? I'm not getting into that. I don't want to get into that argument, but it still is. Once you are removed from the event and having to rely on evidence and forensics and testimony, why is it beyond a reasonable doubt instead of beyond doubt? Because technically there could still be a doubt there, but is it reasonable or not? That could be very tricky for a prosecutor to have to deal with anyway. Certainly a robot prosecutor. Human prosecutor obviously would have to be able to handle that. But a robot prosecutor might not be able to rationalize it as well. So it is... Her example is poor, and it is... There is more involved here. Now that's why I said that the trolley problem is better, which is you have a trolley, and I think it is specifically... Well, it would have to be that the trolley is going to... can take one of two tracks. The one it's currently on would have it run over and kill a group of people. The other track would have to kill only one. You ask the robot, okay, which are you going to do? Are you going to leave it, which would mean that it will kill 3, which by inaction, or by action do you have it strike and kill the 1? Needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few kind of thing. That is better because that... a better test, better dilemma, because there's only 2 choices. Well, 3, technically, because, well, to act to change, or to not act to change, which technically there can be different reasons for that. There can be failure, just failing to act, which is the same as choosing not to change the track, but still, it's one or the other. So that is a better example. But then I guess it's also, why couldn't a robot... Yeah, that's true. Why wouldn't the robot's response simply be to charge at the streetcar to stop it, at the trolley to stop it? I was like, the reality is very, very rarely binary in such situations, in such events. So a robot, why are we assuming it must be held to only these 2 options? What's this next one? Oh, yeah. So this is also interesting. And again, this is actually something I'm pretty sure would have been true back then. So because Quinn does eventually make this public, US Robotics has had to basically hire private armies to keep it safe, because there's so much hatred towards robots, which is one thing that I wish weren't the case here. I mean, I get it. I really do. But I don't think that the fundamentalists that are described here would be as populous as described. Because while you could have fundamentalists, I think most likely they would just keep to themselves and not really care. But anyway, the fundamentalists are the ones that don't want the robots on Earth, well, in any populated place. But anyway, there's that. But it's also with Byerly, police are monitoring his house to keep him safe. But then also Quinn does arrange for a warrant to go and search for any evidence of robots in the house. The guy goes, hands him the warrant, he looks at it, and he hands it back. That's actually wrong. The warrant is yours. It is given to you, and you keep it. That's also why, if you've ever seen the show Bosch that Amazon has, I don't remember which season it is, but the murdered man owned an apartment, and they need to search it, and that every search technically would require a warrant. Well, anytime they're looking for something new, it would require a warrant, because a warrant specifies what it is to look for. That he does seem to get right. But when they go in, they set it on a table there, because who's the actual owner? It's like, well, the guy is dead. It might, and I'm trying to remember what the situation was, where it doesn't necessarily make sense for it to go to the wife or something, but they have to leave it there, because it's for the owner of the apartment, whoever that is. So they set it down and they leave it. They don't get it. They don't take it back. So I dislike that. Because as I said, that is incorrect. A warrant is given over to the person. And I think that is even a requirement when it is served. That it is whoever it is served to, they have that copy. I'm not sure how subpoenas necessarily work. I do know that one aspect of subpoenas is not always just you've been served, but it is that you actually have to sign it. But in any case, moving on. So this is the do to search the house, come back, and it is like, okay, well, now I need to search you. And what the heck? That was weird. But Byerly objects to this, and it's like, the paper isn't sufficient. But if you're a robot, you don't have right of privacy. Because he's basically saying that, well, for you to search me would be violating my privacy. True enough, but that paper still isn't sufficient. It recognizes me. What the heck is going on there? Let me do that. It recognizes me implicitly as a human being. Where, the process server essentially snatched at it, where it says the dwelling, place belonging to, and so on. A robot cannot own property, and you may tell your employer, Mr. Haraway, that's the guy's name, that if he tries to issue a similar paper which does not implicitly recognize me as a human being, he will be immediately faced with a restraining injunction and a civil suit which will make it necessary for him to prove me a robot by means of information now in his possession, or else to pay a whopping penalty for an attempt to deprive me unduly of my rights under the regional articles. That's the thing I want to get to, the region stuff. And it's like, this is what I was saying before about him just not playing the game. Is making Quinn make the moves is best, because he does have these rights, he does have these protections, such that it's a, well, no, that doesn't get to work. But it's also this guy, he had in his pocket basically a pocket x-ray machine, so he took a picture. But Byerly was actually wearing something that would, how it's described is, not that it blocks it, but that it's like emitting the same rays, so the film would just be overexposed. It would be useless. It would be like taking a picture of a light. A light that's on. Which frustrates Quinn, because it's like, well, that shows that you're trying to hide something, so you must be a robot. But Byerly then points out, and that you or your men attempted illegal invasion of my rights of privacy. The devil they'll care for that, the public. They might, It's rather symbolic of our two campaigns, isn't it? You have little concern with the rights of the individual citizen. I have great concern. I will not submit to X-ray analysis because I wish to maintain my rights on principle, just as I'll maintain the rights of others when elected. So I just wanted to bring up the next highlight. But yeah, I mean, it's like, this is what I said about how these are very intelligent moves that he's making here, because it's saying, you're the one in the ridiculous position, the ridiculous situation. I don't need to make a move here. I just let you go, and we'll see. It's kind of the cover-up being worse than the crime thought, that the reaction to an event can sometimes make it worse. You're adding energy into the situation. He's letting Quinn put in all the energy he wants, because that will drain him. And it does make him seem a fool if he's proven wrong. And also, for a lot of people, a fool anyway. Okay, okay, yeah. And this is even pointed out later, after Byerly has actually been elected. He's not yet in office as the mayor, but he has been elected. And Calvin has gone to talk to him. And this is Byerly talking. It wasn't entirely... Yeah, Quinn did most of the work. I'm picking up in the middle, I'm sorry, but my men started quietly spreading the fact that I had never hit a man, that I was unable to hit a man, that to fail to do so under provocation would be sure proof that I was a robot. So, hang on, I lost track. So I arranged for a silly speech in public with all sorts of publicity overtones, and almost inevitably some fool fell for it. In its essence, it was what I call a shyster trick. One in which the artificial atmosphere which has been created does all the work. Of course, the emotional effects made my election certain, as intended. Let him build up the situation. Let him spend all of that. I need to do one thing, whatever it is, one thing, to prove him wrong. And now everything he has built, it's like a domino falling, but falling in my favor. It's his domino that falls, but falls in favor of me. It's very, very politically intelligent there, so I really like that. Let me just check some of the stuff here. Okay, yes, I need to talk about that. And that's a good thing to talk about. I think, okay. So yeah, one other thing to add in here that I have kind of forgotten, besides the points that I still have yet to cover. So there is another person here called John, who is member of the family for Byerly, and he's a cripple. With his legs are useless, half his face doesn't work, and his throat is also damaged, so he has a very, very harsh voice. Okay, I just want to check the time. So the theory is this, that is actually the real Byerly, who never fully recovered from his car accident, and instead, because he had a hobbyist interest in robots, made a human robot and trained it to be his replacement. Right? And in theory, this is all possible because that John had for 2-3 months been out in the country at a private home of his that was never searched. And it was stated before that a humanoid robot with human skin, human eyes, all that, would take about 2 months to make. So in theory, he could have made it. And it's actually very heavily implied that this is what could have happened. I wish they were a bit toned down, that, to be honest, but, let it be a bit more ambiguous. I mean, it still is potentially ambiguous. And it could even be keep the ambiguity around. That may be desirable anyway. But anyhow. Yeah, it's just I needed to mention that. But it also gets into one of the other points here, the idea of what it takes to create a humanoid robot. And there are some problems here. So what he describes is basically taking an ovum, which, yeah, I guess that is technically true, because if you just remove the half genetic material from it and put in complete genetic material, you would then have what you need to develop a full human. But what is described earlier in the chapter than we're at now, it's close to the beginning, that you would grow human cells that would then be attached to the robot that would have, I think it does describe a silicone sponginess to them so that it clings to the robot. Well, here's the problem. So let's say that that's true, that's what it takes. The robot still needs to eat. Because while the robot's systems would be powered by electricity, these aren't. Our cells aren't. They need nutrients. They need water. They need all kinds of things. So you would need a digestive system that is fed for these cells to survive. And it's also, cells die. The systems of your body that are involved with just handling that are really impressive. It's like just using skin for the example. It flakes off. Right? That's the majority of dust around us is the human skin that falls off just naturally, but also through exfoliation. Like we scratch like that, it comes off. Hair naturally falls out. Some of us faster than others, but it does just naturally fall out and get replaced because it is constantly growing. Your blood does die eventually and leaves the body as part of our solid waste. That's why it's brown. Trying to think what else. There are also some things that they will get recycled in the body and just completely reused. But it's you've got the lymphatic system that does constantly clean stuff out of your body, out of your bloodstream. But it's, there's also that. You're technically always internally bleeding. Like, it's actually one of those things where I don't remember ever being taught it, and I think I may have looked up once, but just when you stop and think about it. Blood is carried in blood vessels all over your body, right? Okay, how are the blood vessels, which are composed of cells, fed by what's in them? Because it's like, how do you have all the red blood cells? And what actually makes sense is, well, eventually it reaches a point where it's just the blood passes out of the vessels to everything around them. And then it gets picked back up. It just, by, not osmosis, but it'd be like pressure that, because the arteries have higher pressure, goes out, so it'll spread outside of the blood vessels. I think this is the case. But then it's the lower pressure of the veins draws it back in after it has deposited the oxygen, the nutrients, all that. So it's like you're kind of always internally bleeding, but that's how it's supposed to be. Yeah, and then it just gets picked back up and you're fine. It's all managed. It's still a closed system, essentially. A robot couldn't have all that stuff and still manage to be a robot. I was like, okay, you need the positronic brain. You need a power source for that. You potentially need artificial muscles and such for moving the thing around. I was like, there was so much involved there that, for the robot, but there's also all these systems for humans. You'd need both there. The dude would have to be huge, right? But even then, if you're making him larger and larger and larger, that's more and more human material, biological material that you have to satisfy. So, yeah, it's just one of those. The suggestion here of creating it from the start doesn't make sense. And I'll point this out that you do see this in other science fiction. The Terminator. Not Terminator 2, The Terminator, the original movie. Which, by the way, I think is actually better. At least as far as the story goes, I think it's better. I get Terminator 2 is a great action movie. But the original Terminator is very good. But as it progresses, the Terminator's skin actually starts rotting. It's decomposing. And it makes sense because it wouldn't have a system to maintain it, and also only needs it, well, first for blending in, but to go through the time jump thing, the time portal. But once the portal is used, and once the mission is complete, once the termination mission is complete, it's done. It doesn't need it anymore. So it doesn't matter if it would only last, say, a few days or a week. It's irrelevant. So you don't need all those systems. You just need it to last sufficiently long for that. And you're good. You're good. So it makes sense there. Whereas this, no, it has to be years and years and years. So yeah, that is a problem that I have, because it should be more involved than what is described there. Which, to be fair, I've said it many times before, I get technical. I get technical. If I were to be writing robot fiction and try to do this, I would be designing out that robot, right? And it would be pretty complex. Because, I mean, you need so many different things. You'd need an artificial heart to move the stuff around. You would need a digestive system. I mean, it's all sorts of things. One thing I'm not sure if you would need, you would need something that would manage the hormones and produce them. What I don't know if you'd need is sleep. I don't know if the benefits of sleep are restricted just to the brain or if, like, your skin can benefit from sleep. I'm not sure, because I think that hormone levels do change while you sleep, and so that would have an impact on non-neurological things. But if you can just regulate that by other means, then that may solve it. So that I'm not sure about. But it still is the other things, the sleeping, the eating and the drinking. It's like a biological robot would require those, would still be required to do those things. I was actually just thinking that perspiration is also something that a biological robot would need to do, potentially more so because it needs to be, there might be more heat that generates and needs to evacuate. All right. Okay, so I talk about that. One more point. There's a mention of Calvin kind of likes the idea of robot politicians because they would be free of this and that, including incapable of tyranny. Is that? Yes, incapable of tyranny. It's like, no. No, actually, in some ways, a robot would be worse. Because, okay, I recognize the definition of tyranny as being essentially the rule of man. That it can be capricious. It can be just like off with his head. That's tyrannical. It's like there's no reason for it. Just say, I want somebody killed. Versus rule of law, which is then, no, true, the laws are made by man, but laws are supposed to be carried out evenly, justly, fairly to all. It doesn't matter who you are. Everyone equal under the law, that kind of thing. Well, a robot, however, with its 3 laws and its own reasoning, there's been nothing to indicate that their reasoning can be changed externally, that you can convince them of anything else. So that means then that they are, by their nature, actually very tyrannical. In fact, when you think about it, going back to with Cutie, what was the name of that one? It'll be easier to look at this. Reason. In the chapter Reason, it's actually very, very reasonable that you could describe that as as Cutie being tyrannical. That he is making these judgments that the humans there are lesser beings, and so he's confining them all. That is absolutely tyranny. Because he is assuming what is best based on his own judgment. That he's not following any laws. It's not possible for laws from his god, the energy converter, to be passed down to him because the thing doesn't talk. It has no capacity for that. He is purely making it up as he goes along. He is a tyrant. So, yes, it is in fact a false statement there. But again, inconsistency that, well, you wasn't written to be singularly coherent, wasn't written to be singularly consistent, so yeah. It's not like The Lord of the Rings, which technically is now a trilogy. Tolkien wrote that as a single book. It was broken up into smaller books later. And it makes sense to still refer to it as a trilogy anyway, but it isn't. It is a single work. So it will be consistent within itself because it was constructed as that. I have an idea for a trilogy I want to do, and that is how I will write it as well. Even though there will actually be a time skip between some of the books. Between like the second and third, there will be a time skip of years. Tolkien, in Lord of the Rings, there really isn't a time skip. Not like that. Not like that. It is basically continuous throughout. So yeah, just the whole, because I would be writing all 3 of those books at the same time, or at least one to next to next, I would ensure consistency. That's not how iRobot, the stories in it were written, so it is fair to forgive that. But it is still no, they can absolutely be tyrannical. And the funny thing is, the next chapter, the inevitable conflict, is very much an example of robot tyranny. But one other thing I want to cover, and I don't know why Asimov wrote this. If it's serving other stories, if it's a critique on humanity, or if it is his own belief, which he describes, and to be fair, he I think I'd seen iRobot is from 1950, which would mean that. Here, let me actually just look it up. I just need to see the years he was alive. He was active, so writing would be 39 to 92. Born 1920. Okay. So then he would not necessarily have first-hand knowledge of World War One. Some, but not necessarily a lot. World War II, definitely. What he describes in here is that basically nationalism has finally been done away with because instead of there being nations, it is just regions. No. This would never happen for so many reasons. Because, I mean, okay. I'm trying to think what would be a fair example. Okay, yes, that would work. Europe. Let's assume a European region that you lose the nations and you have just the European region. That would never happen because the cultures between those nations are radically different. You need a certain amount of borders there because you cannot make it homogenous like that. Like France and Germany, they don't always get along. It's kind of a running joke even. But it's also, imagine this, just as far as religion goes. You have the Vatican there, the Holy See, it's like the whole of Catholicism, as far as like a physical constructed existence, is there. Obviously, there's also the Holy Land, but it's just the Vatican is very important there. A fair amount of Europe, though, is Protestant, or just some denomination thereof. So you would try to have that all being one region, you would inevitably have conflict there. So, because if you're trying to smash together all these cultures, and that's really my criticism here. The idea of going to these regions, because you would have, in some cases, very disparate cultures that you're now having to treat as equal that you might not be able to, and it's also, you could have the issue of the Vatican is technically its own nation, by the way, but it's very small. If another nation, especially Italy, would decide, we're just going to annex that, the Vatican can't actually do much about it. It wouldn't be able to militarily stop that. You're making a region, so everything would be unified. You would now have potentially a regional government that now controls that. There's no way the Vatican would allow that. I can't imagine Italy allowing it. I can't imagine France or Germany. I can't imagine any of them allowing it in that way. True, European Union has taken over a lot of stuff there, but still there are individual national identities there. Going to a regional thing would necessitate erasing a lot of that. Okay? The United States is different though, but analogous in some means, because we also do have separate cultures between the different states. But it still is, we have a single dominant federal culture, essentially, that we all share, because there are certain common laws there. Some states ignore those laws. Some states write their own laws that on contradiction, but no one's yet argued it enough to make a change, but it still is. We do have that idea of a singular culture already, that then there are differences in the subcultures, but a singular overarching culture. You couldn't force a region. You couldn't have a region, because a region would need to have a common culture there, if nothing else because of common laws. You couldn't do that in a lot of places. I mean, it wouldn't be, even just, yes, I know there's a lot of stuff, but just ignoring that, the current political stuff, you couldn't have, despite us being neighbors, you couldn't have the US and Canada in the same region, because there's a lot of things that are fundamentally different between us. I mean, it is what it is there. And you can see that with, like, or using Great Britain, which is in some ways a better example. The UK is a better example because it's, as was said, the Americans and the British are a common, are one people separated by a common language. It's something like that. It's a better quote than what I just tried saying there. But it's like our two cultures are actually radically different because of how we have freedom of speech enshrined in the Constitution in the way that we do. Clearly, they don't from various things that have been happening there. So like, you couldn't try to be like, oh, well, one region encompassing all this. And Canada would also have some of that same stuff. You couldn't do that because there are cultural differences where one would have to supersede the other. How are you going to achieve that? So yes, I don't like this idea of such a region, of going to regions like that, because you will see conflict there. I mean, it's even like for my Catherine verse. I tend not to think of it too much, but at some point I will have a story where I'll have to think of it, but planetary colonies and space stations will be their own separate cultures. But Earth, I tend not to think about it because it would probably be it'd probably not have a unified government like you see in Star Trek. Because things are too different that it wouldn't work. So yeah, I could believe he wrote it as like the trying to get rid of nationalism, because that is part of the issues that around World War II. But also, to be fair, the destruction of nationalism is also part of what led to World War II. It's not just what existed and allowed World War II to happen, it also led to it. So it's all culture is important. And trying to forcibly destroy a culture or make it subservient to another isn't going to go well. It needs to be done very carefully and with respect and consideration. Basically, you need a generational shift away from one culture to another. To have it develop, to have it evolve, assimilating aspects of the dominant culture, so that the minority culture, the inferior culture, there we go, inferior and dominant in that regard. I don't even want to say that because I don't want to imply it is inferior, but just you would see things where they make adjustments to try to then merge with the dominant culture, but it still is possible to maintain a distinct cultural identity within a dominant culture, but it's still some things would be that may only be achieved in some cases by giving up certain aspects of your culture, which, yeah, I'm sorry, I just reject the idea that would be achieved so easily that it's like, oh yes, it's now regions. No. Alright, but that's more of me and Asimov sitting down across from a table having a debate on this than an actual criticism of the book. And also kind of a prediction of what you may see in some of my stories going forward, especially Catherine Verse ones. Well, no, really just one in particular. I don't think I have ideas for other Catherine Verse stories where it would come into play. But the interplay of cultures and how they can be different and what happens when they are separated, what happens when they are connected, things like that. That's going to be a different story. Anyhow, enough of my blathering. I actually do like Evidence, don't think I don't. I do like this chapter. It is an interesting concept. I wish it were explored a little differently, but it is still a very interesting one, and it sticks with me. But the Inevitable Conflict, that one is also very interesting. I'm looking forward to getting that one. See you then.